Thank you very much indeed, Alan, and thank you to all those who were concerned in awarding me this great honor. I'm only sorry that Harvey isn't here to see this and to hear what I'm about to say. I spoke with him on the phone this afternoon, and he said that he was in hospital suffering from pleurisy, having previously been struck down by gout. And we agreed that these were admirably 19th century afflictions to suffer from. You may well wonder what an unreconstructed Scotsman and UK citizen, or as I would prefer to say, royal subject, is doing accepting a Benjamin Franklin Prize. Though certainly my sister's house in Media, where I was staying last night, could use one of those stoves, so thanks for the book. I, of course, should be the recipient of the William Franklin Prize. William Franklin, as you doubtless know, was Benjamin Franklin's only son. And in one of the great tragedies of the American War of Independence, he ended up on the other side, a loyalist, the royal governor of New Jersey. William Franklin spent 2 years in jail as the price for his loyalty to the British Crown, the price of his belief that he could not break the oath that he had sworn. He missed the death of his wife. Washington refused to release him, to let him be at her bedside. In 1782, he went into exile to Great Britain, never to return. And the relationship between the father and the son was never repaired. Benjamin Franklin indeed opposed any compensation being paid to the loyalists who, let us not forget, in our patriotism, or should I say your patriotism, accounted for a good 20% of all the colonists in the 13 colonies. We must remember the extent to which the American War of Independence was a civil war. In many ways, the successor of that civil war that had been fought in the British Isles in the 17th century, and the predecessor of that civil war that would be fought within the United States in the 19th century. At a gathering just after peace had been signed between Britain and the new United States, a gloating Frenchman was heard to say to one of the somewhat downhearted British delegates, and I quote, that the 13 United States would form the greatest empire in the world. Well, he was right. And in that sense, it was Dad, Benjamin, who backed the winner. The son, William, backed the empire that would ultimately be overtaken, displaced by the United States of America. It only seems like the other day that specialists in the field of international relations the world over were debating how best to characterize America's global power. Superpower no longer seemed a sufficient term. With the collapse of the Soviet Union after 1989, a mere superpower surely couldn't describe the stature of the colossus that bestrode the globe. And so other words had to be found. The French inimitably came up with hyperpuissance, which sounds better than hyperpower. Madeleine Albright confidently described the United States as the indispensable nation. And I got into a rather silly and semantic argument about whether it was polite to use the word empire of the United States of America, which had, after all, come into existence fighting against British imperialism. So hegemon, paramount power, all kinds of terms had to be devised as euphemisms for empire. For the rest of the world, it seemed perfectly obvious that a great power that had the capacity within the space of 2 years to invade both Afghanistan and the plains of Mesopotamia must indeed be an empire, the successor not just to the British Empire, but to the Roman Empire itself. What a difference a decade can make. Those arguments about American empire now seem very distant indeed, and in many ways somewhat comical. Today, the mood of public disenchantment, of anger, following the biggest financial crisis since the Depression, casts a long shadow over American power itself, calls into question not just the hyperpower, but the very power of the United States. The other day, I was looking through some of the documents that are generated by the Congressional Budget Office as it tries to grapple with the question of how to bring American public borrowing under control. And I noticed that one of the scenarios, carefully worked out on a spreadsheet with numbers projected forward for a decade or more, one of the options was boldly stated as a reduction in the number of US military personnel overseas to 50,000. 50,000. If that is something the Congressional Budget Office thinks it worthwhile to calculate, the amount that would be saved by such a drastic reduction in the American military presence overseas, then something very profound is at work in this country today. The state of American foreign policy seems enfeebled in the most extraordinary way. I've just returned from a trip to Asia. A week ago, I was in Beijing and then in Hong Kong and in Singapore. And as I traveled through Asia, what struck me most was not so much the somewhat dejected figure of President Obama at Seoul at the G20 summit, achieving next to nothing. Not so much the crestfallen figure of Tim Geithner, whose proposal for limits on current account surpluses and deficits had been swept aside in an afternoon by the People's Republic of China. No. What struck me most was the attitude of the Chinese themselves. The phrase, "we are the masters now," does not seem an inappropriate one if one is trying to characterize the mood in Beijing today. I had extraordinary conversations, private conversations over dinner in the homes of some leading economists in Beijing. And I was startled by the frankness with which they discussed their plans for future global predominance. One of the most interesting things about China is that it has a plan. That's one of the things that distinguishes communist regimes from other regimes. And their current 5-year plan is a document that repays close study. What they intend to do in a whole range of avenues poses a major challenge to the power of the United States and can be realized, if not within 5 years, then conceivably within 20 years. Wherever one looks in the world today, whether in the Middle East, where the so-called peace process limps on in its usual futile, inconclusive way, or in Iran, or in Afghanistan, wherever one looks, American power appears to be, at best, stagnant, at worst, in retreat. The rise of China seems to me to be the thing that future historians will depict as the greatest challenge to American power of our time. And yet it's strange to reflect on how little attention has been paid by American policymakers to that challenge over the past decade. I would estimate that it still occupies a very small percentage of the time of the US President or Secretary of State, as compared with the Greater Middle East, for example. I want to take the opportunity I have this evening to get you to reflect on the magnitude of this challenge, the scale of the historic change that we are living through. What we are witnessing is the end of 500 years of Western ascendancy. The great story of the modern era, from the late 15th century until relatively recently, has been the story of the rise of the West. Nobody in the early 15th century would have put any money on that happening. If you had gone on a world tour in the year 1410 or 1420, what would have impressed you most would have been the achievements of the Ming dynasty. By the 1420s, the most magnificent spectacle in the world was indeed the Forbidden City, where I was just the other day, marveling at its scale, its sheer size. If you'd gone to London in that same year, you would have been dismayed to find a tiny little smelly town with no more impressive building than the Tower of London, a jail. There were about 50,000 people in early 15th century London. There were about 1 million in Beijing. You would, in fact, have been more impressed by the Ottomans than by any of the West European monarchies that were completely against the run of play from the late 15th century onwards to become completely globally dominant. And in the process of their rise to global dominance, to create, not only here in North America, but in South America too, vast global empires. We mustn't forget that the United States is just one of the many byproducts of this extraordinary explosion of predominantly Northwest European power. It's over. It began to be over about a century ago, actually, when, for the first time, a non-Western society figured out that if you can't beat them, you'd better join them. That society was Japan. In the late 19th century, the Meiji Restoration transformed Japan from being an isolated and marginal economic player into being the first modernized Asian power. And the trail that Japan blazed was subsequently followed in the second half of the 20th century by all the major Asian economies. The big story of what we call the Cold War was not actually what went on in Europe, though it attracted most of the attention of scholars. The big story of the Cold War was the success of that model of westernization in a whole series of Asian economies. Think of South Korea, poorer than Ghana in terms of per capita income in 1950, admitted to the OECD, one of the most rapidly growing economies of the whole second half of the 20th century. And not only South Korea, Singapore, the success of Hong Kong, that remnant of British imperialism in Asia, and later on, the spread of economic reform even to Malaysia and Indonesia. What China and India have done, beginning in China in 1978, much later in India in 1991, has been essentially to follow belatedly that model of economic modernization that the Japanese first adopted. And so with the addition of the two most populous societies of the world to the great Asian modernization bandwagon, the era of Western ascendancy has come to its inevitable conclusion. That is the most important thing about our generation's experience. What future historians will say about us is this: we were the ones who presided over the end of Western ascendancy. And we were in many ways victims of the classical Greek problem of hubris. All that talk of hyperpower and American empire a decade ago, less, was the hubris, followed inevitably by nemesis. Just consider for a moment this. By 2027, it is highly likely that the gross domestic product of China will equal that of the United States. This year alone, China accounted for 20% of all the growth in the world economy, 1/5. China has become, in the last year, the biggest automobile market in the world, overtaking the United States, the biggest manufacturer in the world, the second biggest economy, overtaking Japan this year. The biggest initial public offerings in the world are happening right now in China, with that for the Agricultural Bank of China setting a new record of $22 billion. China consumes 46%, nearly half, of all the global production of coal, of zinc, of aluminum. Now, when I present such stark statistics to American audiences, a substantial proportion, and I suspect you are no exception tonight, say to themselves, ah yes, but all they're doing is assembling the products that we clever Americans design, albeit in California rather than in Pennsylvania. But I want to jolt you out of that complacent assumption that the world is just an iPad designed by Americans and hammered into shape by the Chinese. No. If you look at the trajectory of, for example, patent applications, or indeed patents granted, what is most striking is to find that China has vaulted from a negligible position to being one of the top 3 initiators of intellectual property. They overtook the Germans last year. When I told a German audience that, they really didn't believe me. But it's true. And that is part of a wider and strategic effort by the People's Republic of China to cease to be merely an assembly line for Western corporations and to become a genuine rival where it counts most, in the realm of technological innovation. As an economic historian, I'm here to tell you that technological innovation isn't the most important thing, it's actually the only thing. That is the real driver of economic growth. Without that, all delusions of power are just that, delusions. It seems to me that the vast mobilization of resources we currently witness in China today into the academic sphere, into research and development, particularly into research into so-called green energy, these things together constitute a deliberate attempt to catch up with the United States. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, this is talked about quite openly. The only reason, I was told by a leading economist in Shanghai, that we haven't invited you to take a job here yet is that we don't feel there are quite enough English speakers here for you to have good lunchtime conversations. Something very profound is happening, in other words, and we cannot any longer console ourselves with the thought that they need us as much as we need them. This is the chimerica idea that I sought to popularize in The Ascent of Money, the idea that the world depends on a symbiotic relationship, a kind of marriage between China and America. Now, this worked very well for a time. It was like one of those marriages in which one partner did all the saving and the other partner did all the spending. And you may know of marriages like that in your own lives, I hope not your own personal lives. And you know what happens with those marriages. The Chinese do have an alternative strategy to chimerica today. And that, too, they're quite open about. They no longer feel comfortable to own somewhere in the region of $2 trillion of US dollar-denominated international reserves. They openly criticize the monetary policy of the United States and openly fret on an almost daily basis about the dangers of a dollar depreciation that would hit the value of their international reserves. What they do instead, and they've been doing it now systematically for over a year, is to switch out of dollar-denominated securities and into commodities, into hard assets. We are right now in the midst of one of the greatest shopping sprees in the history of base metals, agricultural land, you name it. There is not a commodity that the Chinese are not interested in. There is not a commodity-rich part of the world where they are not present, seeking to make investments, from Australian iron ore mines to agricultural land in South America. It is the most extraordinary scramble that is going on in sub-Saharan Africa today. And I know this because I've visited Africa several times this year. From Senegal to Namibia, there is a scramble for Africa going on, the like of which has not been seen in the world since the late 19th century. But there's one salient difference. Only one country is scrambling this time around, and it's China. What makes China's ambition the more alarming, to me, is that it coincides with a period of grave weakness in the United States. And it is that weakness, ladies and gentlemen, that emboldens the leaders in Beijing. The financial crisis has weakened the United States in two distinct ways. First, it has delegitimized the American claim to know how the economic world works. Who now uses the phrase Washington consensus without a jeer in the rest of the world? Our model failed. From their point of view, there no longer is any need to listen to lectures from the great panjandrums of the economics departments of the United States. And I don't entirely blame them for being glad of that. But it's not just that we've lost credibility. It's not just that the great economists now are figures of fun. More alarming to me is the fact that the financial crisis has left us with a fiscal crisis, the strategic consequences of which I now want to say something about. In attempting to cope with the crisis of private debt, the United States, more than any developed country, has created a crisis of public debt. If you simply calculate the relationship between, for example, the debt of the federal government and the tax revenues that it can raise from its citizenry, from you, you will be startled to find just how large that ratio is. Let me tell you what that figure is for Greece. Greece, the well-known basket case of the Western world, the famous G in the acronym PIGS. Greece, the scene of one of the great fiscal crises. Greece, the scene of that terrible tailspin that a country gets into when the bond market no longer believes in the credibility of its future fiscal policy. For Greece, the relationship between debt and revenue is 312%. That is to say, if you calculate the ratio of debt to tax revenue, you get the number 312%. The figure for the United States? Well, since you ask, it's 358%. In fact, that's the largest of any developed economy. Now, I could give you more figures to make your flesh creep, but suffice to say that figures like that bear out the analysis that I made earlier this year in an article for the Financial Times, that the Greek tragedy that began last spring is a terrible warning to all developed countries not to find out the hard way what the upper bound is for public borrowing. There is some upper bound, but we don't know what it is. There is no magic number. Each country gets to find out what it is by borrowing until it hits that upper bound. And the lesson of the Greek experience is do not go there. Do not keep borrowing until the markets call time. Because once they do, a ghastly process unfolds. As your credibility is suddenly lost, it's not that your borrowing costs go up by 1 or 2 basis points. No, they go up by 200 or 300 basis points. Greece's borrowing costs more than doubled in the space of a few days. One of the lessons of financial history that everybody interested in statecraft needs to learn is that it's not linear. It is not gradual. When you lose your credibility, it's like a jagged upward spike, or rather like a tailspin. Because as your borrowing costs rise, so the cost of rolling over your debt goes up. And as that goes up, so your deficit widens. And as your deficit widens, so your credibility falls, and the risk premium rises, and the yields go up further, and the deficit gets larger. My colleague, Kenneth Rogoff, in the economics department at Harvard, has recently written an excellent book with Carmen Reinhardt with the wonderful title, This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. What they show in that book is that this has happened many times before. It's actually a recurrent feature of history. The United States is not the first empire to play the game of seeing how much it can borrow, rather than confront harsh fiscal choices. This is what the Spaniards did in the 17th century. In their case, it wasn't the printing press that they resorted to, it was the silver mines of Mexico and Peru, but the effect was essentially the same. The Spanish monarchy either defaulted on its debts or it inflated them away. In the 18th century, it was the French that did this. The French crown either defaulted on its debts or inflated them away after the revolution in the great assignat hyperinflation of the 1790s. In the 19th century, it was the turn of the Ottoman Empire to play the game of default and inflate. One of the biggest defaults in all history was in 1875 when the Ottoman Empire defaulted on its debt. By that time, please note, Ottoman debt service, the interest on the Ottoman debt, was absorbing half of all tax revenues, 50%. In the mid-20th century, you guessed it, it was Britain that went down this road. Crushed by the burden of debt incurred in defeating Germany and Japan in World War II, my country experienced decades, not of default, but of inflation, of a subtle creeping erosion in the value of money, a reduction in the debt burden by stealth. Even if, for the next 2 years, let's say 2, nothing happens, and the bond market sleeps as some of you are sleeping now. Morning. Sorry. I don't want you to miss this, sir. It's only 9:10. I'm about to stop. Even if Paul Krugman is right, and let's not rule that out completely, even if interest rates stay as low as they currently are, aided and abetted by quantitative easing 2, the sequel, even then, because the United States is borrowing more each year and is set to borrow more each year until around about the year 2085, when the Congressional Budget Office gives up and stops projecting, the rise of interest payments as a share of your tax revenues is inexorable. Right now, it's about 9 or 10%. 9 or 10% of all federal tax revenues go on interest payments. If nothing is done, if nothing changes, we carry on this current course, that number will rise to about 20% over the next 10 years. 10 years after that, it will be 36%. By 2040, it will be 58%. More, in other words, than the Ottoman Empire was paying in interest payments on the eve of the Great Default of 1875. We are in a dire situation. And we cannot any longer pretend that there is some magical cure for the stagnation of the economy or the fiscal crisis within which we find ourselves. Neither Milton Friedman nor John Maynard Keynes can save us. It isn't that easy. neither quantitative easing nor yet more fiscal stimulus, the things that Paul Krugman and other born-again Keynesians argue for each week, can solve the fundamental underlying problem, of a structural crisis of public finance that predated the financial crisis, which I warned about in a book called Colossus in 2004, B, of structural crises in the US labor market that mean there really are no jobs in the world market for most of the people living in Michigan who don't have any education. You can't fix that with QET, folks. That's not the problem. Harvey said to me, before I even got on the plane to come here, you must end on a positive note. So I must. I'm from Scotland. We don't generally end on positive notes. You lose the battle, lose the match, go home, drink whiskey. But we are in the United States, and I want seriously to tell you some good news, because there is some. First of all, we did actually avoid a Great Depression. Up until June of last year, that was by no means certain. And you have to just remind yourself once a day how much worse the situation was in 1932 than it is today. And we avoided it, with monetary and fiscal stimulus. That much worked. It was enough to avoid the Great Depression repeating itself. And credit should be given where it's due to those who took the correct decisions and learnt from the history of the 1930s. But we also have avoided the Great Depression because of China. The third stimulus, and in some ways the most important, was China's incredible expansion of credit that turned China into an engine of growth as it is today for the whole of the world economy. Now we're dealing with the hangover that always follows stimulus. This is really the key to the situation we find ourselves in. And we can't kid ourselves that the hair of the dog that bit us, that yet more stimulus is any longer sufficient. The second piece of good news is that I believe the public mood is ripe for radical reform. The public mind has moved far ahead of the mind of the political classes in this respect. Americans are not Keynesians. On the contrary, they view the growth of the national debt with great anxiety. That is clear from opinion poll after opinion poll. And what is heartening to me about the recent midterm elections is that they expressed that mood of impatience. The American people do not want to be Japan, nor will they tolerate a lost decade, much less 2 lost decades. The second piece of good news, in my view, is that Americans are ready for the kind of radical change that is urgently needed to redirect this country out of the debt tailspin. Now, I was disappointed in the political responses to the recent draft document, the Simpson-Bowles document, produced by the Financial Reform Commission. But I was heartened by the document itself, which seems to me to be at least a first step in the right direction towards the radical reform, not only of the entitlement system, not only of the entire system of federal expenditure, but also, just as importantly, of the tax system, which could be so much improved by a simplification of the tax code and a reduction of the corporate tax. There are many, many straightforward things that this country could do to accelerate its growth rate and reduce its debt. If you don't believe me, take a look at Paul Ryan's roadmap for fiscal reform. He is one of the few people in Congress thinking seriously about these issues with the bravery to spell out what has to be done and the kind of painful changes that must be implemented. The final piece of good news is that if these fiscal reforms can be implemented, then it is not inevitable that the United States will decline and fall like all empires in the past. Because not all empires, in fact, inevitably and inexorably declined and fell. Empires have bad times, but they can bounce back. That's, of course, what the British did after 1782, even if it did William Franklin no good. I believe radical fiscal reform can be the basis for a rejuvenation of American grand strategy. Both at home and abroad, the United States has the ability to get its act together. I began by talking about the 1770s in honor of the man, the great man, after whom this prize is named. I want to conclude by briefly reminding you of the 1970s. I am looking around the room and I think you mostly can remember the 1970s. You know, things didn't look too good for the United States in the early 1970s either. They didn't look good economically. Stagflation was the name of the game, and they certainly didn't look good geopolitically, where the Vietnam War was coming to an agonizing conclusion. Think back to just how bad it looked when Jimmy Carter was president. Remind yourself of all those people who wrote the United States off then. And yet, with radical monetary reform under Paul Volcker and radical fiscal reform under Ronald Reagan, the United States turned it around. And I believe we can do that again today. What we must remember, though, are the words of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, whose bust was sadly returned from the White House shortly after President Obama's arrival there, famously said, "The United States will always do the right thing, but only after all the alternatives have been exhausted." My message to you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is do not exhaust all the alternatives before you do the right thing. Thank you very much.